Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 18. Through this podcast, I've had the very good fortune to speak with some amazing nature journalists and nature stewards, people I deeply admire and look up to. Today, I'm speaking with another such person. His name is Tom Hunt, and he's a fellow Australian. He's very modest, and I know I'll embarrass him just a little bit by saying this, but I consider him to be one of the most moving nature writers I've ever come across. He speaks and writes about nature in such a poetic and connected way that I always feel transported by his words, like I'm seeing what he's seeing. I'm in the place with him, seeing the sun reflected in such a way, or the flash of colour on a bird's wing. Tom is a field ecologist who's been to some extremely remote locations around Australia as part of his work and PhD research. Come and listen to the stories of some of the amazing things he's seen. Tom, thank you so much for being here on the podcast with me. It's a joy to chat with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Bethan. It's so nice to be able to probably have a chat with you after all this time, being in contact.
Yeah, so we have known each other in inverted commas on Instagram for a bit and following each other's work, and I just love your work, so I'm excited to go a bit deeper into the background.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this chat and see what little conversational wormholes we get to go down.
So I often start by chatting about people's nature experiences in childhood, and I'd love to ask you that question. What were your early nature experiences?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to grow up on a beautiful property in the Piccadilly Valley in the Adelaide Hills. So just next to Adelaide in South Australia, there's the Mount Lofty Ranges to the east. These beautiful rolling hills full of stringy bark forest and farmland and heath. And I grew up on this big property there and was able to just gad about as a kid, exploring outside. We didn't have, mobile phones or computers or anything back then. Wow, I'm showing my age now. We had a TV, but we were very restricted in watching it. So we spent a lot of time outside, which was great because I was so captivated by it all. And I guess that really initially sparked my love of nature. Well, yeah, I don't know. I guess probably everyone, given the opportunity as a kid, loves nature, loves natural things, loves watching a snail on a leaf or a bird fluttering about. And if that's not fostered, I think that's probably lost. But I think everyone intrinsically has that real engagement, that biophilia. I think the ecologist Edward O. Wilson called it.
Great word, yeah.
It's a great one. And if you're lucky enough to be exposed to nature, or to be get to go camping with your family, or have a neat little nature park near your place, or like me, have a backyard with a forest and all these animals and stuff around, that is fostered, and you actually carry that through later in life. You don't lose that. So that was just exploring things was my real formative experience with nature. And birds especially. I mean, I'm an ecologist, but work a lot with birds in ornithology, and I guess I'm interested in all aspects of nature, but birds in particular. And I'm not particularly sure why that is, but I remember that we had my mum and dad. They weren't involved in the environment world at all. They did very different jobs, but they really wanted to get us all engaged in it. And they had this big poster of the parrots of Australia. There used to be this organisation called the Gould League, which put these posters together, and it had every parrot in Australia on there. And my mum says that when I was probably a couple months old, I would just stare at it. If I was held in someone's arms, I would just want to stare at it. So I don't know what part of, birds I'm so interested in, but it's just always been there. And so I always knew as a child, if I could, that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. I wanted to work with birds, research birds, do something with birds. I had a little dalliance with dinosaurs for a while there, as every child does. And I remember it being quite hard to decide, oh no, what am I going to do, birds or dinosaurs? And I was overjoyed when the paleontological evidence came out to indicate that birds are in fact just living dinosaurs. They're not different enough to ever be classified as anything else. So
you didn't have to choose.
I didn't have to choose. That was a big relief. Yeah, and so over the years I've been quite lucky. I've never wondered what I wanted to do. I wondered whether I was going to be able to do it, or whether I had the skills to do it. But that's always been that thread there. Yeah.
I love that. I love stories of people whose childhood passion just seamlessly blends into their adulthood career. And I'd love for you to talk a bit about your research. So you're doing a PhD now, and you've done a lot of research all around Australia. Can you chat a little bit about the research you do now?
Yeah, so I'm doing my PhD looking at bird communities along the floodplains of the Murray River. Specifically the woodland birds, because these floodplain woodlands are threatened because of the lack of water coming down the Murray River. We all know about the big issues with the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and drought and everything like that. There's been a lot of research done with fish and with wetland birds, but there's not much known about how those watering regimes and the lack of flows coming down the river actually affect the woodland birds that use the floodplains. So these floodplain woodlands are essentially what are known as a green corridor that snakes all along the river. And the Murray River, as it comes into South Australia, it's actually going through dryland country. So mallee and open woodland, saltbush shrubland. And that river corridor, that green corridor, is actually acting as this really productive environment in a landscape that is much drier. And so, especially in drought years, which we have had relatively frequently in the last little while in Australia, the floodplain woodlands are thought to be really important for even all those dryland birds to actually come in and use as a refuge to keep their populations going, to find food, so that when there are, the boom years in a boom and bust system, they can move out from those floodplains and move out into the drier areas. And that dynamic between different habitat types at a landscape scale actually allows these species to survive in a dry, harsh environment that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. The problem is with our changed flood regimes, lack of water coming down the river, over extraction, these floodplains aren't getting the water that they normally would have. And especially there's a group of trees called black box, Eucalyptus largiflorens, that is usually on the higher elevation areas of the floodplain. And so even when there is a little flood pulse that might break the banks, the big river redgums that everyone's familiar with will often get a drink, but the black box woodlands won't, and they're degrading quite badly. And there are some people who are managing these systems who have suggested, well, look, there's never going to be enough water coming down the river. Maybe we just need to triage these habitats. And triage is a concept where, if you're not going to be able to manage something or look after something, you kind of let it go, which, as a philosophical idea, is sometimes quite useful, but in a natural environment, it can be utterly disastrous, obviously. And so I'm trying to actually see what the effect of losing those woodlands will be on the woodland birds in that immediate area, but also for the birds across the Mallee, across the whole landscape, because everything's connected and all these habitats have a kind of complementarity about them. Suffice to say that it's not good when when the trees lose their leaves and they die and all that system degrades. So that's what my thesis is about. And I'm in the throes of doing the analyses and writing that up now. But I'm also lucky enough to in the meantime have been doing some other work all across the state. I do various projects in the Coorong Lagoon in the southeast, which is at the end of the Murray River, which again is in pretty dire straits because of the lack of those flows. We have also done some recent banding projects looking at regent parrots along the River Murray, putting little GPS satellite trackers on them to see where they go.
Yes, I just saw that. Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but I was excited because I just saw it on your Instagram page, and oh my goodness, what an exciting project. Can you describe what that involves?
Yeah, so that project is run through the Department for Environment and Landscapes SA, and we are looking at this endangered population of a beautiful parrot called the regent parrot. It's endemic to Australia and is only really found in riverine areas in eastern Australia. And in South Australia, they're an endangered species. And we know very little about them. We don't really know why their population is declining. We have some ideas, but we are really interested to see where they travel and what they're feeding on, and why they do what they do. They've got these amazing kind of lime green and bright yellow plumage with dark blue wings and black blue tails and this amazingly red orange beak. They're really spectacular birds. So we actually have recently gone out to catch some. We put up these fine nets called mist nets where they, in their fly-through areas, they're really fast-flying birds. They've got these amazing kind of sickle-shaped wings which help them speed through, at kind of 60 k's an hour.
Wow.
Yeah, they're really fast flyers, and they can fly big distances in a day. So if you're trying to track them in a traditional sense with put a little radio tracker on the back of a bird and get a big handheld aerial, you can do that with some species, and you just find the direction that tracker is sending a signal from, and you follow it on foot or maybe in a car, and that's fine for species that use a small area, but there's a river in the way of where these birds live, the biggest river in the southeast of Australia, and they also fly tens of kilometres in a day, sometimes even hundreds of kilometres. So instead, we have these very special satellite trackers which have a little solar panel on them, and they receive GPS signals to actually locate them. But instead of having to go out and follow them, it sends those coordinates of where the bird is a few times a day up to a satellite, and then you can access that remotely.
Wow.
So you just sit in your office after after a long day and see where the birds have gone, and it's a much easier way to do field work. But you have to catch the birds first, and we had a few mornings of not catching them at all. They would just zip past the nets, and once they're gone through their flyway, they're not coming back that day. So we only had one day left to catch them, and eventually we had about a little flock of 12 fly into the net, and you pull them out as soon as you can. They don't really get tangled; they just sit in the pockets of this nylon netting. So you grab them out, you have your hands absolutely chewed off because they've got these really powerful bills. They're not thrilled about it. But we bag them, and then we take them for processing. We make the processing period as short as we can, but we have some vets from Adelaide Zoo come to put the birds under anaesthetic, and it makes the birds. It means the birds are not stressed when you handle them, and when you do the fiddly process of attaching those GPS trackers to the back of the birds, and essentially it's like a little backpack. The GPS tracker weighs less than 3% of the bird's weight. That's the ethical standard. That you have to have. The birds are about 180 to 200 grams, so that the trackers are only about 5 grams. And they they are attached with a harness. It's like a backpack that is secured around their wings. We cinch that down, we weigh the birds, we look at their condition, we take genetic samples, and then they come out of anesthetic, and we release them again. And all going well, the trackers start pinging back data. So we've got 4 birds out there at the moment, telling us some really interesting stuff. So yeah, it's really neat to be part of projects like that, and yeah, to also get to see all these parts of Australia as well. That's part of the fun. We recently have also done some work on Kangaroo Island after the big bushfires,
Yes.
and I'd done some work previously on the island, and it was quite shocking to go out there and see the destruction from the 2019-2020 bushfires. It burnt about half of the island in one season, and huge swathes of vegetation. But we've been out there looking at how birds are affected by that fire, how where birds have taken refuge, the tiny little pockets of vegetation that was unburnt, and we are now looking at we've now set up a long-term study to try and track what bird numbers are doing in those fire scars and see how the populations respond. Because despite being a very fire-prone country where fires happen all the time, we actually know very little about how species populations deal with fires, and especially fires at this scale.
Yeah, that was an outrageously hot fire season that wiped the vegetation in a way that is not normal.
No, it was an extremely hot fire. It was an extremely destructive fire, and the plants in the eucalypt heath systems that grow on the island are somewhat fire adapted, and some of them indeed need fire to reproduce. Things like Banksias need fire, the heat of a fire, to open their cones to release their seeds, and a lot of Australian plants have fire-induced germination. So the chemicals that are in smoke actually induce their germination, and people in native nurseries actually know this now and use smoke water to germinate to germinate Australian seeds because of these little adaptations. And obviously, if your seed can survive a fire and you can germinate after it, the fire's actually done a great job of clearing out your competition. So it's can be a really good way to regenerate a habitat, and for a lot of species, a really good technique to grow without the competition and potentially complete their reproductive life cycles whilst they can, and then leave a seed bank for other individuals' next fire. But the issue with a fire that burns so hot is that it can damage the seed bank in the soil. It can burn seed cones to the point where the seeds are damaged, and for fire-adapted trees like eucalypts and mallees. Mallees are a type of kind of many-stemmed small eucalypt that we get in Australia, which sprout from these buds underground or buds from their trunks. We found in a few places on Kangaroo Island that the fires were so hot that months after the fire, when you'd normally get a whole lot of regrowth, those trees weren't resprouting yet. There was this huge delay because those buds closer to the surface, the epicormic buds, had been damaged by the heat of the fire. And fire is a very integral part of the system in Australia, especially in drier systems, dry woodland systems. But fires of that scale and intensity are not. And more we're going to see fires like that as climate change increases big weather events, and there are more droughts and more extremes. So we're trying to see whether our birds out there can survive. There's a few species and subspecies which are found nowhere else other than Kangaroo Island, and we want to see, okay, whether they can survive this fire, how they survive this fire, and therefore when the next fire inevitably comes through, what management actions we can take to ensure a certain area of habitat doesn't burn, a certain number of hectares don't burn, or doing emergency translocations of species to get them out of harm's way, and also looking at, in the aftermath of a fire, what resources are there or not there, what the pinch points for species are. And by knowing all that, we have a better chance of actually saving those species next time round. But we've got to do the groundwork first and collect the data.
So interesting. I'm really wondering about how you maintain, because your work as an ecologist, you're seeing these amazing species, you're seeing the details that no one else sees in a joyous, beautiful way, and at the same time you're really aware and close to habitat destruction, species loss, tragedies like this fire that went through. I'm interested to know about this dichotomy, like joy and despair in your work, and how you hold and manage these two things inside yourself, like the same time staying positive in the face of despair. I don't know, balancing hope and despair in your work. What does that say to you?
It's a good question, and I don't know if I have a good answer for it, because I do struggle with it a lot, actually. We are living in a world that has every element of it has been affected by humans. And as an ecologist, I go out into the parts of the world that I'm particularly interested in, and I am specifically documenting what's gone wrong, what's been damaged, how we've affected all these species. There's a really interesting quote by Aldo Leopold that I always think of. He was a US nature writer, and in his book, The Sand Country Almanac, he writes that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. And essentially he's explaining that you see the level of destruction in an area that other people, don't necessarily think of or don't necessarily see. For example, I'll have, living up in the Adelaide Hills here, we have an absolutely wonderful environment. There's trees everywhere, there's rolling hills, but we have, since European colonisation in Australia, cleared 90% of the native vegetation in the Mount Lofty Ranges. Now, this is one of 15 national biodiversity hotspots in Australia because of the diversity of plant animal species that we get here and the uniqueness of those species. And yet we've already done an incredible job of destroying that environment. And when you look out on these beautiful kind of bucolic rolling hills, especially right now in spring, it's looking lush and green. We've had quite a good bit of rain this season and this year, which has been nice. One of the better things about 2020, and things are looking great. But and people come up here and they think it looks glorious.
It looks idyllic.
It looks idyllic. And unfortunately, when I look out on it, I just see, I imagine what would have been there before, vast swathes of forest, really productive swamplands, heathlands full of birds. And even I don't have a good idea of how spectacular and how rich and how biodiverse it once would have been, and the abundance of species that would have been here just over 200 years ago before Europeans came. But I have an inkling. And, every generation there's that shifting baseline of, you talk to older people and they say, I remember that, all those suburbs used to be lovely open woodland. And I remember seeing, the black cockatoos there, or we used to have scarlet robins coming in our garden and we don't see them anymore. But a young person doesn't know that those things were there 50, 80 years ago. And so the baseline shifted to what they think is normal. And in another 80, 100 years, however long this generation will live, there'll be another story of environmental degradation and reminiscing about how much has changed. But that's only one generation, and it entirely relies on a younger generation actually listening and learning about what used to be there, or people actually researching historical documents or reports from what the first colonists wrote, or what naturalists recorded in certain areas, and actually educating themselves. But for the layperson, there's not necessarily any reason to realize how much has been destroyed.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's a kind of blissful ignorance,
Yeah. So you're carrying a weight that other people don't carry because you know what's being lost.
Yeah, it's tricky, and I do sometimes struggle to know how to balance that. That quote by Aldo Leopold goes on to say that either an ecologist must harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and doesn't want to be told otherwise. So he's saying there that, even sometimes if you can tell people what's going on, people don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
And
wow, that's a powerful quote.
Yeah, it's a hard one. It really it really cuts deep to the core of what I struggle with. And knowing what we've done, but also knowing what we continue to do, especially in Australia, where we continue to clear vegetation. To some degree, 200 years ago, you can't necessarily blame the colonists for trying to start a new life here, clearing vegetation and trying to farm, trying to support their families, this, that, the other. And they didn't know the things we know now. They didn't know that if you clear over a certain amount of vegetation, you lose the species that habitat supports. They didn't know that, but we know that now. We've done the research. We don't have any excuse to continue to destroy vegetation, to degrade the environment, and yet it still happens. I mean, luckily in South Australia, to a lesser extent, because we have quite strong vegetation clearance laws that came in about 1980, but only because we had cleared so much by 1980 that suddenly everyone was like, "Whoa, hang on, what's going on here? We need to do something about it." But in places like New South Wales and Queensland, they've still got kind of vast swathes of what it might be as near to wilderness as you can get anywhere these days, and they're still clearing it. And in the Mount Lofty Ranges, given that 10% of habitat that's left, it's not enough to support the species that are here. We've already lost about 9 species of birds from the Mount Lofty Ranges that used to be here. 9 species have gone extinct. And of about 110 woodland bird species in the Mount Lofty Ranges now, about 50 of them are declining and will go extinct in the next 100 years if nothing's done to stop. Because whilst we've already stopped our vegetation clearance, there's a delay in the effect of habitat clearance on the biodiversity that uses that habitat. It's called extinction debt, and it's this delay that you see if you fragment a habitat, if you over time, little patches that do remain, they degrade, they get filled with weeds, or a fire goes through and wipes out an entire little remnant population of a species there. And in a landscape where the remnant vegetation is just patchy, there's nowhere for species to recolonize from. There's no source populations. And so one by one, these little populations of a species will wink out in all these little patches, and then suddenly they'll disappear. But that process takes decades sometimes, and it's still happening here. And so there's this time delay which humans are really bad at dealing with and getting our heads around. So you say to someone, we need to put back habitat to stop these species disappearing. And they're like, well, I still see birds everywhere, and there's still magpies in my back garden, and either they're the very common species which have done well with in an agricultural landscape, or they're ones that are just holding on, and they will disappear. And that's why it's really important to have data that shows you declines before you get to that edge. But then we've seen, especially these days, it seems that even when we do have that hard data and that knowledge, it's really hard to get through to people sometimes, and especially politicians, dare I say it.
Yeah.
I know they have an awful job that I would never want to do, and they have to make lots of tricky decisions, and yet, yeah, a lot of the time science doesn't seem to be listened to, or recommendations from hard data are just
Yeah.
ignored. And through my work, I try and get people engaged in that stewardship for the natural world, that wonder in it,
Yeah.
that all those fascinating stories that I find absolutely incredible. Um, other people do as well. That's a way to kind of foster that interest. How can you worry about something disappearing if you
Yeah.
don't care for it, and how can you care for it if you don't know anything about it? But even then, there are some members of society who you can show them the most amazing experience, and they still are not interested. And also, yeah, those people in positions of power seem to might have it in the back of their mind, but it's not. We're not doing enough. We're not taking big enough steps, it feels, to actually stop the wholesale collapse of our biodiversity. Um, and it's hard because it feels like there's this climate of an abandonment of nature in some ways, whether it be because of economic greed, or political point scoring, or just that passive social apathy. People didn't have that interest in nature, or altruism fostered from a young age, and it is hard not to feel helpless in the face of it all. So yeah, some days I do get really down about it, and in those times I feel that the only way to get back my motivation for what I do, if I'm going to have a career in ecology and in the environment, um, I can't get swamped by that. There have been times when I've
Yes.
thought, man, should I just do something else? This is too hard, and it's not enough, and you know maybe I should just become a chartered accountant or something. But other than that being, I fear, beyond my skill and interest level, I feel like I don't want to be doing anything else. So I have to find a way to,
Mm.
I guess, tap back into that current of wonder for nature that
Yeah.
is I think in everyone, really, even if it's really buried deep. To somehow tap back into that stream, into that flow, and you know remember why I'm doing this in the first place. Try and have that childlike wonder of seeing, an ant carry a caterpillar to its nest because the caterpillar has exuded a pheromone that tricks the ant into thinking it's one of them. The caterpillar's taking on the ground into its nest, and it's protected there by the ants, and then it pupates into a butterfly. There's this amazing symbiosis, and you see that, and it blows your mind. These,
That's wild.
yeah, these every species has a story, right? Um, there's there's another quote that I always try and remember. It was by Aristotle, so it's an old one. But he wrote that in all things of nature there is something marvelous, and it's true. There's every species, the myriad of life around us, every gum tree and centipede and bacterium and froglet and that magpie warbling in your front yard, that's the product of billions of years of evolutionary whittling, an infinite number of mutations, essentially through generations of each species, and natural selection has culled to guide changes in form and function, and it's just this mind-boggling, unfathomable process that has created every individual organism that we see in the world today, right now, has this incredible history behind it. And, those results are so mind-blowing sometimes, so clever and beautiful. Every organism is this masterpiece. Every organism is the result of this amazing evolutionary history all its ancestors have traveled along. And I find that that's the way that I can kind of get hooked back into it, because humans are storytelling beings, right? We find stories very powerful. We connect with stories. It's how we really connect with anything, by telling a story about it. And so I think knowing the stories of our wildlife, and kind of appreciating those the countless threads of relationships and symbioses and everything else that connects each organism, it brings me back to it, and it I think it humbles and enriches our lives as well. So essentially, when I'm feeling really down, I have to go back out into nature and not collect data, not be out there to be, okay, I've got to survey these 5 patches of habitat and find these species, because you're on a time limit then, and you see some amazing things, and you can take little moments to be like, wow, that's great, but I'm on the clock here, and we've got to set all these traps for tonight, and we've got to do A, B, and C, and we've only got 1 hour of sunlight left, and we've got to get up in the middle of the night and check those cameras and survey those nocturnal creatures. And field work takes you to some amazing places, but it doesn't always let you have too many moments of reflection and of noticing. So I think, being able to notice those things in nature and reconnect with them, and making time to do that, which I often struggle with, but I'm trying more and more, to do that.
You do this beautiful thing on Instagram where you take us for a walk with you, and I'm smiling a lot now because of your description. I can just feel the joy coming out of you when you're talking about nature. And I smile when I'm watching your walks as well, because you take the camera and you just look around, and you love birds. You have an ornithological focus, but on these walks, you're all about whatever interesting thing you can see. There's an ant, come down here, and you'll crouch down with your video camera and you will say, here's a caterpillar, here's a plant, here's an orchid pretending to be this. It's just such a joy to follow you on these walks that you take us on.
I'm so glad you think that. That really warms my heart, because I go out there and I'm by myself, kind of, just talking to myself, and it's quite a strange thing to go out there and record that. I originally started doing them during the first coronavirus lockdown, and in South Australia we were quite lucky that we were still able to go out and visit our national parks fairly early on, whilst we still had to isolate, but a lot of people couldn't, and we couldn't really go out in big groups and walk with other people. But I quite enjoy going out to parks, seeing what's there and seeing how seasons change things. And so I thought, well, look, I can film some of these things. I don't know everything. I'm often out there being like, finding a creature. I have no idea what that is. And I have to look it up, or, I take a guess, and, so I never guarantee that all that information on those stories is 100% accurate. And often you'll see me writing a little caveat in a comment and clarifying something, or I get the scientific name of something wrong. But yeah, I find that, often I'll go out and be like, what am I going to talk about today that people might find interesting? And I'm racking my brains, and I never have to worry, because
Yeah.
There's always stuff to come across, and I either think, what do I know about this species? What can I say about that, or about its ecology, or about how it fits in the habitat in general, or if it's a plant, something basic about plant anatomy that I remember from second year undergrad at uni. Um, so, and that's what I find so interesting about getting out in nature. And it's been really nice after that first walk that I recorded. I got such a great feedback from it that I was like, maybe I can do this semi regularly. Um, and so I've gone out in each different season to different parks to look at what's out there. Um, and it's also probably better than me doing that with people in tow, because I often go out for a walk with someone
Mm.
and they'll be like, yeah, let's go for a hike here then, and I will be moving at this glacial pace because I'll be stopping to try and look at the sundew petals to work out which species it is. And I'll hear this bird call and I want to stop, and people find that interesting for the first 10-20 minutes, but after about 3 hours they get quite tired of it. So this is the better way, I think, of communicating those things. And when I go out with mates for a walk, we can actually just do the the exercise thing.
But it does really feel like being with you, just because you're talking to the camera really friendly and just as if the person is there. It really feels like walking with you. And it really does feel like a celebration, just a total celebration of nature. And there's something I wanted to talk about. So it's to do with celebrating nature. So on September 7th, Australia celebrates National Threatened Species Day. And you do something really creative on this day. You participate in the Threatened Species Bake Off. And I'd love for you to talk about the Threatened Species Bake Off. It just makes me smile so much to see what you create.
The Threatened Species Bake Off is great fun. It is an initiative that's the Threatened Species Commissioner runs. That's Dr. Sally Box at the moment, and it was actually started by my friend Beck West, who is she runs a sanctuary out in New South Wales called Wild Deserts now, but she studied in our office for a little while at uni, and every time someone would hand up their thesis or had some milestone, she would create this cake in the theme of their study, or create a cake of their animal that they just spent 3-5 years studying.
That's amazing.
And it was incredible. And she eventually went on to work at Arid Recovery, and there she met the Threatened Species Commissioner and came up with this idea, like, let's do a Threatened Species Bake-Off, where we raise awareness of threatened species by baking. And it's just gone from strength to strength every year. And so the first year she was like, right, Tom, you have to bake something. You can't get out of this. So, oh God, what am I going to do? And I'm not a particularly good baker, but I do quite like art, and so that's how I approached it. And
It's absolutely a work of art what you've created in here.
so the first year I made a mallee emu wren. That's an endangered tiny little bird, a bit like a fairy wren, that we were doing a project on in Western Victoria, and moving a population of them back to South Australia where they'd gone extinct. So I was working on them at the time, and I thought, right, a mallee emu wren, I could do that. What colours do they have on them? They've got a beautiful blue bib, a lovely kind of golden crown and rufusy colours all through them, and some brown on their wings, and this amazing long feathery tail, really sparse feathers that aren't barbed or anything. That's why they're called emu wrens, because emus have these very strange sparse feathers, and the tail feathers of these wrens actually look quite similar to them. So they're not emu size, they're emu wrens because of the similarity of their tails. So I created this cake essentially by cutting up hollow bits of dried fruit in the colours that I wanted. I found some blue sweets that would make that blue bib, and I crumbled some chocolate to make that really fine sparse tail, and that was my creation. And that went down fairly well. It didn't taste too bad either. But
Did you feel bad for eating it?
I didn't actually eat it in the end. We actually auctioned it off
Did
at a
you?
raffle for a conservation charity that I'm involved in called BioR, and we raised money for their habitat restoration projects by raffling it off.
Perfect.
And then it was shared around, and I was very, very relieved that it didn't taste utterly unpalatable. Um, but I had no idea how to use fondant or do any kind of cake decorating thing. So I just approached it through using all these little bits of fruit and piecing them together into this essentially mosaic, which took an enormous amount of time.
Yeah.
And I'm very glad that this competition only runs once a year, because I need about 11 months break before I'm mentally prepared to tackle the next one. But the problem is, now that I've set a precedent, I have to
Yeah.
do this every year, right? So I have to think of a new bird every year, and try and up myself as far as the skill output goes. But I feel I'm getting better at it, and I look at my first creations and think, oh no,
Yeah.
I'd do them differently now. But it's great.
So 2020's entry was a striated grass wren, and it was completely intricate. You were even, I think, putting the details on with tweezers, and it was very, very it was very intricate. All this dried fruit and coconut and licorice, and creating the striations on the bird. It was a thing to behold.
This year I thought I'd document the whole process, because people were interested in how I went about it. And luckily I was able to use time lapses to speed it all up into the course of a couple minutes. But it takes probably about 2 days all up, for baking and prepping and everything else. So yeah, it's strange, because I'm not a chef by any means, and I don't consider myself an artist. But there's this odd combination that I've actually found quite enjoyable, and I think is a great way to raise awareness of these threatened species. So the striated grass wren is another mallee bird that's endangered now. They have any bird with very specific habitat requirements, like the mallee emu wren, the striated grass wrens. They live in spinifex shrubland, and so they're threatened by grazing, by habitat loss, and everything like that. And so I also do a little spiel talking about them. Again, another way to kind of connect people with what's out there, and highlight the issues. And year on year, the threatened species bake-off gets more and more entries, and it gets bigger and bigger. So it's really exciting to see it grow like that. You can look on social media for the hashtag TS Bake-Off, and you can scroll through all those incredible entries that people make, and you don't even need to be particularly adept at baking or decorating. Some people have some absolutely ingenious ways of doing these really effective and amazing pieces that really conceptually and skill wise wouldn't have taken much, but the creativity is incredible. It's nice that there's another channel, I think, to do that.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's bringing art into a whole new realm. It's so cool. I want to talk to you about art, because you told me that you used to make art and then you stopped. And I know that you have a perfectionist tendency. And this comes up a lot with people. There's something about art that threatens people. And I'm interested to know about your relationship with art. What you used to do, what happened, what you feel.
It's really interesting, isn't it, how much of a barrier people can feel to it, and how much of a hurdle I sometimes feel it is as well. Because as a kid, I used to love drawing, especially birds. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear. And I found so much joy in it. I'd see an amazing bird in a book. I'd pour through all these bird books, and I would draw some incredible bird that I found. And I didn't think twice about that. And as I went on through primary school, I would draw more and more and more. And then there was a point at which I started to want it to be really good. And rather than just slapping something down on a page with reckless abandon, I would want it to be as accurate as possible. And that was okay because I could hone my skills, and I was doing it lots. But then that, coupled with the fact that as you grow older and you go into high school and you get busier with study, and then after that you start working, and firstly you have a bit less time, I feel, or you make less time to do these things.
Yes.
And because you don't do it as regularly, and because I didn't, I found that I was more reluctant to just put something down on the page, because I would get frustrated that it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. And then, knowing that I wanted to work with birds and have a career in science, I did a science degree at the University of Adelaide, and went on to do honours and now the PhD. And it was really interesting that in that process, I stopped doing art completely. And not that happens to everyone. Some people both manage to get into the nitty-gritty of science and continue their art habit. But it kind of fell by the wayside for me. And it was also tricky because the higher into academia that I went, the more your mind is trained to think scientifically and think theoretically and through hypotheses and testing and data and analysis and this quite rigid form of the scientific process, which is a very useful thing to learn. But for me, that fed into being very precise and very accurate, but also I felt my brain became more data-centered rather than creative. And you talk to any of the best scientists out there, and they will say that creativity is one of the most important things for science. They're not mutually exclusive. They're really important for thinking and developing ideas, to have a creative side and a curious side to the way you approach things. But I don't think that's necessarily always the way it's traditionally taught in academia. It certainly wasn't so much my experience. And so that way of thinking, coupled with how busy our lives get and how much less time we make for fun things, joyous things in life as we get older, and more worried about other things, and we have difficult experiences in life and challenges and obligations and bills and everything else. I think it's quite easy to lose that creative side. I certainly have found that. And it got to the point where I couldn't even think about drawing anything, because I was like, well, now I haven't done it for years, and it's going to be absolutely terrible. What's the point? Unless it's going to be perfect, I'm not going to do it. which I think a lot of PhD students think that. It's a lot of where the imposter syndrome comes from. Everyone struggles with that, but it's especially honed, I think, in postdoc graduates, and it's a shame, because it also means that, certainly for me, I found that in the rest of my life, it made me much more rigid, and it made me, I guess it made me less relaxed about everything else in life. It made my approach to life, I feel, much more stuck. And so at some point I realized, okay, I need to do something about this. This isn't working. And for me, that's actually where nature journaling has come in, bringing it back to your whole podcast, Bethan. I guess I still had some creativity for a while. I guess I channeled that into photography.
Yes, I was going to say photography is insanely beautiful, and that is in itself an art form and an outlet for creativity.
Yeah, so I found one of the great things about doing fieldwork is that it sends you to places that you would never normally visit, right? You wouldn't necessarily go there on holiday. You've been sent out to walk 3 kilometers into a barren gibber desert with about 3 shrubs in a 10-kilometer radius, and you have to get up, 2 hours before dawn to get there and hike out there to the site you're surveying, and you just think, what am I doing here? This is insane. And then that's the only place that you have a chance of seeing a thick-billed grass wren. This is a tiny little bird that lives in these sparse chenopod shrublands in this barren country, and they thrive out there. And you're out there at dawn and you're dead tired, and suddenly you see this species, and it's the most gorgeous thing perching up on a little shrub, singing its heart out. And you think, wow, like I would never have seen this otherwise,
Yes.
right here in this place that no one else has maybe ever been to, in this particular spot. And it's fantastic. And I wanted a way to capture that, and kind of share that. And so I've started channeling my creativity into photography, and there's a lot of creativity with that, and there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of play that you can have with the visuals and the style and everything else, and especially I think trying to photograph birds is one of the hardest subjects you can tackle. So I really dove into the deep end there. So it takes lots of practice to even get one shot of a bird. You have to take about 1,000 to get that one that's good. And so I enjoy sharing a lot of those moments that other people don't get to see, and talking about them, and writing about what makes that species so amazing, or trying to write about that moment in time, and trying to capture some of the feeling that made it special for me. And so that's what I've been, I guess, doing for the last few years through social media, is putting those photos out there and writing about them. But it is a creativity that's quite different to drawing, I find. And there was still this element of rigidity, I suppose, in photography. And at the start of this year, I had a friend post on Instagram that she'd done some nature journaling, and she'd drawn this beautiful paper daisy. She's an ecologist as well, but she'd put her hand to it, and I was like, "Oh, that's great. I've heard of nature journaling." And she's like, "You should definitely do it. What do why aren't you doing this?" and I thought, "Oh God, I've got to draw again. It's got to be perfect. I don't want to. If it's bad, I won't want to do it." And she was saying, no, that's not what it's about. She's that's not it. And then I found your account and started looking into it, and the pieces that you have on your website, the blogs you wrote about, what nature journaling is actually about. It's not about making the most perfect thing. It's actually kind of the opposite about that.
Totally.
It's about going out into nature and noticing things, and noticing, what we're so lucky to be a part of, right? And then recording whatever, any aspect of that in any way. And in a way that was almost too daunting the other way. There was too much freedom. But I remember chatting to you about it, and you were saying, hey, look, like there's all these different exercises you can use to start you off, and different ways to tackle it, and different questions you can ask. And there was a whole lot of material that you put me onto, that the incredible John Muir-Laws puts together. Such an incredible nature journaler. And I thought, you know what, like I need to do this. I need to find a way to get back into art, and I think this is gonna be the thing. But making a cake look pretty once a year is fun, but it's not quite enough. You need to practice these things. Like with anything, you need to make it part of your routine. And so then you had the amazing idea of International Nature Journaling Week, and I'm like, right, okay.
And during that week, you blew my mind. You participated in every single prompt, and you were putting things up that I was just so amazed with. And I even told you at that time, I want to copy your style. It's so free. It's so amazing. You were doing like landscapes with a fine liner, and it was just so cool. How did that feel? Like suddenly you're doing it. You're doing it every day, and you were filling pages with these beautiful nature journal spreads.
Yeah, it was. I'm glad you liked him. Yeah, I I think pleasant surprise is probably my first reaction in that. Yeah, I was amazed at what I could do, and how easy it actually was if I let go of all those anxieties and that
Yeah.
perfectionism, and just sat down to do it. It's all well and good talking about the thing, but that's not doing the thing. you know.
Yeah.
And so it was really liberating in a way. And it was during lockdown as well. So I just went around my property here in the Adelaide Hills, looking in the stringybark forest, looking in the garden beds, looking down through the valley, and it was a week of noticing all these things that I had become so familiar with that I, had kind of begun to not see anymore.
Yeah.
And the process and the structure of that that journaling helped me to not only kind of sit down and take something in, but be really mindful of it and notice everything I could about it. You're trying to capture something of the essence of it on paper, and in that process, you see so many more things, even if you don't end up putting that down on paper.
Yes.
There's so many more things, and not only visually, but when you have your mind in that mindset, I found that I notice the smells around, the smell of gum leaves in the forest, the sounds of birds and what birds I was noticing, and it was actually this multi-sensory experience being out there, outside sketching, and not worrying and not focusing too much on the exactitude of the lines that I was drawing. And I will say now that there were some bits of those images that I I drew and I was very unhappy with. But I knew that I still had to post them because, yeah, that's what you told me I had to do. Um, and But it's good. It's good to learn to loosen your grip on, I guess, those things that happen that aren't necessarily ideal, and those
Yes.
mistakes that are made. And I find that in a way that meditative state and that observing state from nature journaling, the more that I've done it, the more I can carry that through to my day-to-day life. And
Mm.
everyone struggles at times, and you know there are lots of times you want something to be different to the way it is.
Yes.
I'm sure everyone's had that, right? And everyone has dark days, and I have days of being completely despondent and depressed about the state of the environment. And by taking that step back and journaling those things and noticing those things, it helps to loosen your grip on all those things you can't control, not just in art but in life. And
Yes.
that has saved me this year. I think, you
Mm.
know,
Mm.
the last couple of years have been, tricky ones for so many people. And finding moments to do that, finding ways to incorporate journaling into my routine and that way of thinking into my day to day,
Yes.
noticing that poetry of the world around you. That's the way to get through it. That's the way that I do manage that ecological grief and, you know, my own challenges in personal life and professional life. It's finding that that passage through, and for me that's nature that paves the way through that passage. So I'm really glad I got into nature journaling. I'm so glad you encouraged me to do it, Beth. And
I'm so glad that you started again making art, and that the way you speak about it is absolutely perfect. The sensorial experience, the noticing, the meditation of it, it's beautiful. And the way that can translate into living in a better way, living in a calmer way, living in a more centered way. It's beautiful.
Thanks. I think it is too. And I think it's such a great way to tap back into that inherent biophilia that everyone has.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's, dipping your hand back into that current of fascination and joy in nature. And there's lots of ways to do that. Like the photography I do, the walks that I post, they're all different little ways to do that. And journaling's another way to be able to notice that and to find, to rediscover those reasons that I do what I do, to rediscover that motivation and that wonder. And no matter what's going on in the world around you, all these things are still there. They're always there. This, this kind of constant in life, that wonder in nature. It's always there if you look for it.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for being here with me, Tom. It's been an amazing chat, an amazing experience to hear all your stories.
Thanks, Bethan. That was so much fun. Really enjoyed talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. During the chat, we talked about the seasonal bushwalks Tom does, taking his viewers along with him and describing the amazing natural wonders he sees along the way. You can find these walks along with his incredible photographs of flora and fauna of Australia on his Instagram page. His handle is @moth_nut. You'll find the link to his page in the show notes for this episode. I love the way Tom reflected on how noticing nature, spending time in that place of curiosity and wonder, helps loosen our grip on things we can't control in art and also in life. He talks about nature journaling being a way of thinking, which I completely agree with, and he describes this way of thinking as noticing the poetry of the world around you. And I love how he brings it back to that focusing on this poetry, this beauty, these little daily miracles of nature all around us. That's the way to get through difficult times, be it the final slog of writing a PhD thesis or a global pandemic, or whatever it is for you in this moment. So I hope this has been a lovely reminder to you to stay in that place, stay focused on the poetry of this beautiful world. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.